This is FE Peer Review. The date is July the 23rd, 2023. Buckminster Fuller and his world map, as well as a lengthy digression. Dynamic maximum tension, Dymaxion. That's a word that we're going to encounter a few times throughout this video, and that's where it comes from. Dynamic maximum tension. This is about Buckminster Fuller. Some of you may know of him, others may not. He was born in 1895, died in 1983. I remember him vividly as he traveled all over the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, giving lectures at university campuses. He was eccentric and hugely admired, and his lectures were often 8 hours long. They were what was called in those days happenings. He was a great promoter. He knew how to build his fame and spread his messages, and fortunately he had a lot of great ideas, a lot of fun ideas and groundbreaking and creative. He made a great contribution to the times. His beginnings were as an engineer, and in the 1920s, when he was trying to sort of find himself as a young man, he decided he needed to focus on how to make people's lives better through engineering. Among the earliest projects to come to people's attention, to bring his name to the attention of the country, was what he called the Dymaxion house, which we see some pictures of here. It was a prefabricated house that was built of aluminum, could be basically folded up and put on the back of a truck, trucked out to the site, a very minimal foundation, was placed on site, and then the house was put on it. He very cleverly had a central pier right in the middle of this circle, which was a concrete footing, where also things like the sewer line could be coming out of the house and the water lines could be going in and the electrical lines. And that was the only real foundation. And then what was happening, as you can just see in this photograph where I'm circling the mouse, there were metal straps that tied into anchors in the ground, and these straps were tension straps. So this thing couldn't tilt. Even though it was only supported in the center, it couldn't tilt because the tension straps would hold it in place. The thing is, with tension, you can pull these metal straps extremely hard, and it's a very efficient use of the material, whereas you can hardly put any compression onto those straps at all. You'd have to have much more material in order to support this on a conventional foundation. So this gives you a little insight into who he was, how his brain worked. He came back to his Dymaxion house design in 1945 and did some additional work on it, expanded it, made it quite a bit more interesting and certainly more livable, because I have to say, the earlier house design, is clever and innovative as it was as a piece of structure, is not the kind of structure that most people are going to want to spend their lives in. The newer model, 1945, was bigger, more comfortable, and in general more livable. We see a picture of it here. Now, of course, being the self-promoter that he was, he tended to make out as if he was the only person in the world who was coming up with bright ideas. There were, in fact, other people with good ideas at the time. I'm going to share with you one by the name of Norman Belgedis, one of my favorite designers. Belgedis, who died, let's see, I think it was 1956, thereabouts. His work now is all kept in the library at University in Texas called the Ransom Gallery. Here are a few pages from one of his notebooks where he had worked out a modular housing system that consisted of prefabricated panels with doors and windows incorporated into the panels, and also interior walls, interior prefabricated bathroom and kitchen units. But the thing is that they could be assembled many, many different ways, rather like a Lego set. This meant that each house could be different from every other house and customized to the person's needs, which was an insight that a lot of other people like Buckminster Fuller were lacking in their attempts to make housing construction more efficient. And Belgedis had it right, because in the United States, houses remain to this day basically customized and unique. They're not off-the-shelf products like cars. And the American public is really not interested in houses that are made like cars. They want their houses to be individual. So that's Belgedis. I'm going to come back to him a little bit more. Buckminster Fuller really came to the attention of the American public, though not with his Dymaxion house, but rather with the Dymaxion car. The first prototype was released in 1933. The idea had floated around in conversation between him and a few other people for a year or two before that. In the beginning of 1933, he assembled a team of engineers, got some financing, and they produced the first prototype that same year. It was a huge hit, and there's a bit of video I'll show you that shows just how amazing that car was. Now, the thing that's so distinctive about it was its bizarre maneuverability. He designed it so that it could turn on an almost zero radius. I mean, it could just go in circles around itself, and that's a lot of fun to watch. However, that turned out also to be a major flaw in the design because it was effectively very unstable, very unroadworthy, couldn't handle strong winds, was easily overturned, and in fact, the whole project of the Dymaxion car basically faded away when there was an accident in which it was struck by another car, not terribly hard, rolled over, the driver was killed, and the other two passengers were badly injured. That put a bad taste in everyone's mouth, and the whole thing just sort of faded away. But not before they got some good video footage, so let's take a quick look at that. Well, 2 years before Buckminster Fuller produced his Dymaxion car, Norman Bell Geddes produced this prototype design. This particular design didn't go into production. It was more of a concept. In 1933, between 31 and 33, he elaborated on this design, producing a number of vehicles ranging from small car to large passenger bus, all using the same principles. He was hired at that point by a couple of car companies, I think Chrysler was one of them, to help them with a lot of styling on their cars, because what he did very successfully was identify ways to really streamline a car effectively, not just look streamlined, but actually be streamlined, and this could increase a car's fuel efficiency considerably, which, even though it was the 1930s, people were concerned about. So his ideas worked their way into mainstream car design bit by bit, but they were only really taken up in a big way by a certain Emil Porsche, an engineer working in Germany during the 1930s, who incorporated Bell Geddes' stuff into his own designs for Volkswagen, which after the Second World War, he then went on to create his own car company called, as you may recognize, Porsche. So there we go again, Norman Bell Geddes, 2 years ahead of Buckminster Fuller, producing car designs that were prophetic and really useful in advancing the development of car design internationally. This was his 1931 design for what's now called a minivan. In those days, I don't know what they called it. It was hardly a thing at that point. So there you go again. He was being prescient and understanding that the American public was going to want to be able to move entire families around in comfort. Here are models and drawings of a few of his prototypes. We see the passenger bus on the bottom right, and two versions of his minivan. He created several hundred of these little models. I don't know where they are today. I'd love to get my hands on one. They were used for a huge show that he did together with General Motors called Futurama, in which he created a whole section of American landscape. It covered something like 200 feet by 200 feet, and it was a small scale. So he had many city blocks and a piece of countryside and a parkland, and he had highways, and it was all a vision of what an American city might look like in 50 years in the future. Got a lot of things right. He understood a lot about the direction development was going. Had it been a bit more organized and planned, probably a lot of that development would have been much more positive. But we're well into our digression here. I'm just going to share one more little thing with you before we get back to our main topic. Some of the other things that Bell Geddes did that I quite enjoy. So he had many house designs that he worked on, although he wasn't an architect. I've got one page from his sketchbook up in the upper left here, And many years back, I made a mock-up of this design in SketchUp, which I've got on my architecture channel. Some of you know I have an architecture channel. That's my main work. And I did make a few small modifications to his design. The idea was to update it rather than just recreate it. I'll put a link to my architecture channel in the description in case you're curious to take a look at it. It's a very old model, one of the first I did in SketchUp, and rather crude, but it's fun to see. What else I wanted to share regarding Balgetis was this epic book that he wrote called Horizons, which he published in 1933, which contained chapters on individual objects like cruise ships, as we see here, airplanes, houses, cars, fittings for homes, like things like stoves. He had an airport design in his book. He was trying to anticipate the direction technology was going to go over the course of the next half century, incorporating all of the amazing advances that had happened in just the last few years. So we see here a 1932 design for a cruise ship that's pretty mind-boggling when you compare it to what was actually being built at the time. Again, he was focusing on streamlining, but also on safety, which, when you read the description, comes through. Let's take a look at his airplane. You'll get a kick out of that. His concept for a transatlantic airplane was basically a cruise ship that flew through the sky. Now, he had anticipated that flight speeds would be in the range of the mid-200 miles an hour, not the speeds of more than twice that we have today. So a flight from New York to London was indeed an overnight affair. Actually, I think it was a 2-day trip. So the airplane had all kinds of wonderful amenities, including, as you can see on the lower left, a promenade deck, which would be in the front of the wing here. Veranda, cafe, bar, bathrooms, suites for sleeping in, restaurants, cafes, big dining room, and then, of course, lots of support staff. Pity such a thing was never actually built. I don't know if it would have gotten off the ground or off the water. It was meant to be, it was an amphibious airplane. But he did actually work with an aeronautical engineer on the design of it, so there's probably some possibility it might have flown. But just the sheer optimism of it is what gets me going. I love it. And these are just a couple more images of his beautiful house designs. He anticipated a lot of things that did make their way into American homes after the Second World War, such as bedrooms having their own private bathrooms, kitchens being more open to dining areas, things like that. But back to our main point and why we're here today. Buckminster Fuller's biggest contribution, the one that probably has had the most practical use and brought him the most recognition, is his geodesic dome, which we see one example here. He devised many different kinds of geometries for building these domes. There are incredible ways to enclose tremendous amount of space with the least amount of material. And it really did represent some amazing engineering. He really was a genius in that respect, as much as I sort of poke him in the ribs for being a self-promoter as well. Another one of his dome designs. And yet another. I think that's just too outrageously gorgeous. Not one to think small. He even went so far as proposing to enclose a large section of New York City under a dome. This would provide constant, pleasant weather conditions. Certainly would have made New York a place to go to, as if it isn't already. So take your dome here and imagine you've got a nice sharp knife and you're going to go in there and you're going to cut joints and you're going to separate it so that all of these triangles can be laid out on a flat surface but still connected to each other. You could take this whole dome and flatten it out and keep it in one piece. So that was what Buckminster Fuller was thinking when he thought he might try making his own flat earth map. And this is what he came up with. So what he did was he made a geodesic sphere onto which was projected the world, and then he found convenient spots to slice the triangles so that the continents would remain intact. take all those slices and spread the whole thing out, and you have a flat Earth map where all the continents are correctly related to each other, with the splices happening only in the areas of water. Now let's take a look at the distortions involved. As I did in my previous flat Earth map videos, which I will include links to in the description, I've done an overlay which we're going to look at that shows the degree of distortion in various parts of the map, and I'll play with the opacity so that you can see both at the same time. So each orange circle represents a circle, and the extent to which it diverges from a perfect circular shape signifies the amount and type of distortion we're seeing on that spot on the map. So here along the line of the equator on the right, where I'm moving the mouse, that black line is the equator. If we look at this circle here, there's almost no distortion at this point. Whereas when we get to the one above it, we start to see a bit of shape distortion. It's becoming more elliptical. And in terms of size, it's slightly larger. So we see some slight size differences and some slight elliptical shape distortions involved. But overall, there's surprisingly little distortion across the entire map. Of course, the big problem with this map is that it cuts all the oceans, so we don't really get a good sense of what the oceans are like. Buckminster Fuller was aware of that, so he created a second version of his map where he did all the slices in the land and left all the oceans intact. Let's take a look at that. Now, unfortunately, I haven't been able to track down the same graphics as we saw before from the same source. But this is the only graphic I've been able to find of it. But this shows you a whole different view on the flat Earth map and what it really looks like when you keep the bodies of water mainly intact. So on the left here, we're looking at the west coast of North America at the top, and the Pacific Ocean. There's the Hawaiian Islands, and then we come across and there's Asia. Now we're moving south. The equator's down in here. There's Australia, there's Antarctica, and moving across the page and over on the top right is the Atlantic, and we see Europe, the far right corner of the page with the Atlantic Ocean. So that was Buckminster Fuller's world map, keeping the water bodies intact, well, pretty much intact. Before we wrap this up, I wanted to bring your attention to a website called the Buckminster Fuller Institute, bfi.org. I've put a link in the description. You might find it an interesting website to go visit. It's got articles about Buckminster Fuller and his work, including a nice little page about the Dymaxion map. If you scroll to the bottom of the page, you'll see a link to the Buckymap puzzle. That will take you to this web page, sushu.de/Buckymap. Link is also in the description. You can click on the little picture here, and it will bring up, let's clear that. It will bring up this little page. You can make your own, you can assemble your own world map. I started by using the odd-shaped ones. I saw that and figured it was Antarctica and found that to fit it. There were a couple of other odd-shaped bits here. And that got me started. And then I looked at that piece, and I saw that looked like Southeast Asia. I suspect this is Australia. This looks like Australia here. So I think you get the idea. If you find yourself with nothing to do and you want to put a little puzzle together, you can always do the Buckymap. It's like a bit of North America here, and I see Greenland there. I won't make you watch me do the whole thing. I think you got the idea. Now, back to our main feature. Well, that wraps up Buckminster Fuller's World Maps. I hope you found this interesting. Remember, there's a like button down there you can click, and also you can subscribe if you haven't. There are other world map videos that I've done, and I'll put links in the description, and I will also be adding to them soon with a few more. That's all for now. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.